The light on the answering machine blinked like it had been waiting just for her. She hadn't even taken off her coat when her mother's voice spilled into the room, calm, practiced, final. We've all agreed. 3 words that felt less like news and more like a sentence. The message was still there when I got home, blinking red on the answering machine in the corner. I pressed play without thinking, peeling off my jacket as the voice filled the apartment. My mother's voice calm in that way that had always made my stomach tighten. We've all agreed you're not. That was it. No pause, no sigh, no explanation. Just the sentence and the click. I stood there, one shoe still on, staring at the small square of carpet in front of the window. The late July sun cut a harsh line across the floor dust floating in it. My hand was still on the play button. I hit it again. Same words, same tone. The more I listened, the more it felt like she had practiced it, like she had wanted to make sure there was no opening for me to ask why. On the third replay, I caught a tiny thing. The way she said we. That meant Robert. I dropped my bag on the couch and went into the kitchen. The kettle was still half full from that morning, but I didn't turn it on. My hands were shaking, and I didn't want to see them tremble over the stove. Instead, I went back to the machine and pressed play again, leaning down this time. I imagined the scene, Mom sitting at her oak dining table, the one she refused to replace even though the varnish was peeling. Robert leaning forward, elbows on the table, talking in that measured tone he used when he wanted everyone to think he was the reasonable one. Claire perched in the corner of the sofa, legs crossed, pretending she wasn't listening but hanging on every word. And then Mom picking up the phone, pressing the buttons, and delivering my exile in under 10 seconds. The word exile popped into my head and stayed there. I sat on the arm of the couch and opened my phone. The family group chat wasn't at the top of my messages anymore. I scrolled until I found it, the familiar thread with the photo of Dad holding Robert's golden retriever. My eyes caught the gap where new messages should have been. Then the words, "You have been removed." It hit harder than I had expected. My thumb hovered over the screen like I could undo it. The last message I could see was from 2 weeks earlier, Claire sending a link to the florist. I remembered tapping it, looking at the flowers, wondering if I would get to help choose the arrangements. I could almost hear her saying in that brittle voice, "Oh, Elaine, we've already picked everything." I went to the kitchen table and sat down, elbows on the cool wood phone in front of me. My reflection in the black screen looked tired, older than I had felt when I left the office that morning. Part of me had wanted to call Mom right then to demand she explain. Instead, I opened the fridge and stared at the row of jars on the top shelf. The leftover pasta from last night was still in its container. I closed the door without touching anything and went to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, the late sunlight painting the tops of the houses in gold. My neighbor across the way was watering her plants, the spray catching the light. She waved. I didn't. The blinking light on the machine caught my eye again. I walked over and pressed play one more time. "We've all agreed you're not welcome at your brother's wedding." I mouthed the words along with her, this time the rhythm of them sinking in like they belonged to a language I didn't want to learn. I sat down on the couch and let my head rest against the back cushion. The sound of a car door slamming somewhere down the street made me jump. I realized I was waiting for something else to happen, another call, a text, a knock at the door. Nothing came. My phone buzzed once. I grabbed it, heart pounding, but it was just a work email. I put it face down on the table and leaned back, closing my eyes. In the darkness behind my lids, I saw the dining room again, the 3 of them leaning toward each other, agreeing. The word we circled like smoke around their heads. I thought about the last time I had seen them all together. Easter brunch. Claire had brought a lemon tart from the bakery down the street, and Mom had acted like she had baked it herself. I had brought a bouquet of tulips and set them in a vase in the middle of the table, but Claire had moved them to the sideboard so they wouldn't block the view of her dessert. I remembered Robert making a joke about old habits, and everyone laughing except me. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Now it felt like a preview of something much bigger. The apartment felt too small, the air too warm. I got up and opened the window, letting in the faint sound of traffic from the next block. A couple walked by holding hands. A dog barked. Somewhere someone's radio played an old love song. I turned back to the answering machine and considered deleting the message. If I erased it, I could pretend it had never happened. But my finger hovered over the button and then pulled away. No, I needed it. Not for proof to anyone else, but for me to remember exactly how it had sounded when they decided I didn't belong. The light faded until the room was shadowed, the edges of the furniture soft and indistinct. I still hadn't taken off my other shoe. My legs ached, but I didn't move. The machine sat there silent now, but the words were still in my ears, steady and cold. We've all agreed. It was only 8 words, but they felt like the first stones in a wall they were building between us. And I knew sitting there in the half-dark that they didn't plan to take it down. I stayed there until the light outside turned blue, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside, the message still playing in my head over and over, as if it were trying to carve itself into the walls. The first sign had been so small I had almost convinced myself I imagined it. Back in May, when the lilacs were still blooming on the corner of my street, Mrs. Turner from across the hall mentioned offhand, like it was nothing, that my mother was hosting a dinner to talk about Robert's wedding plans. She said it the way people talk about the weather, casual, assuming I already knew. I remembered smiling tightly and pretending I had somewhere to be. On the walk back to my apartment, I thought about calling Emily, my daughter, just to see if she had heard anything from them. But she was away in Seattle for a photography assignment, and I hadn't wanted to drop my unease into her day. I told myself it was probably just a planning session for the bridal party. Maybe Claire wanted to keep it small. But 2 nights later, I was walking home from the grocery store when I passed the restaurant on Oak Street and saw through the window my mother's unmistakable silver hair at the head of a long table. Robert sat to her right, Claire on his other side, leaning in, laughing. My father's shoulders were hunched forward as he listened to someone across the table. I stood there on the sidewalk with a paper bag in my arms until my fingers went numb from gripping it. When I finally looked away, I caught my reflection in the glass. I didn't look like someone left out. I looked like someone who had been erased. Weeks later, there had been another moment. Linda, my parents' longtime friend, invited me to a neighborhood barbecue. She mentioned Robert and Claire would be there, along with some other family members. I hesitated, memories of the dinner I hadn't been told about still fresh, but decided maybe this would be a chance to quietly bridge whatever gap had opened. The day was bright, the kind of early summer Saturday where the sky looked impossibly high. I wore a simple navy dress and brought a bowl of pasta salad, the kind Mom used to like. From the gate, I could hear voices drifting from the patio. They saw me before I could decide whether to slip in unnoticed. Mom in a floral blouse, Robert in a crisp white shirt, Claire in a pale green dress that looked freshly pressed. All leaning in toward each other, deep in conversation. The moment I stepped onto the patio, the conversation stopped. Claire's eyes flicked to me, her smile flattening. Robert shifted in his seat, looking past me like he was checking the weather. My mother reached for her water glass and took a long sip. I sat at the far end of the table next to Linda, who patted my arm and asked about work. I answered in short sentences, watching as Robert quickly steered the talk toward the rehearsal dinner menu. Claire nodded along, glancing at her phone. Half an hour in, I excused myself to bring my empty plate inside. As I passed the hallway near the kitchen, I heard Robert's voice, low but sharp enough to stop me in my tracks. That thing from 2016 will never come out. I froze just beyond the doorway, my pulse spiking. Linda's voice followed, softer, almost soothing. As long as everyone stays on the same page, it won't. There was a pause, and in that silence I pictured Robert's jaw tightening the way it did when he was hiding something. I set my plate in the sink, then stepped quietly back toward the yard, pasting on a smile as I returned to my seat. I barely tasted the dessert Linda served. My mind kept circling those words from the kitchen. 2016. That year had been a blur of hospital visits and bills, the year I had signed away my savings to pull Robert out of the hole he had dug. I told myself they could have been talking about something else, some business deal I didn't know about. But even as I tried to believe that, a cold certainty was settling in my stomach. As the sun began to set, and the string lights over the patio flickered on, Claire laughed at something Robert whispered to her. My mother joined in, her hand resting lightly on Robert's arm. It was the kind of warm, easy family scene you saw in a magazine. I felt like a shadow standing just outside the frame. When it was time to leave, Linda hugged me at the gate and said she hoped to see me at the wedding. Her tone was warm, but her eyes flicked toward my mother, who was busy saying goodbye to another guest. I walked home slowly, the sound of their laughter fading behind me. In my apartment, I set the pasta bowl in the sink and stood for a long time without turning on the lights. Outside, porch lights winked on, one by one. The air smelled faintly of grilled meat and lilacs. I thought about calling Emily, not to unload everything just to hear her voice, but I imagined the edge in mine would give too much away. Instead, I replayed Robert's words in my head over and over. That thing from 2016 will never come out. I already knew the answer I would get if I asked. A chuckle maybe, and a dismissive, "Oh, you're overthinking." Then another wall. Another, "We've all agreed." The street lamp cast long shadows across the floor. I sat down at the table, resting my hands on the cool surface, and felt the weight of something I couldn't yet name pressing against my chest. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about being written out of my own family's story and the quiet understanding that they had been rehearsing this for years. It was the spring of 2016 when Robert's world began to crumble. I remember the phone call, his voice strained and too fast, tumbling out words like foreclosure, lawsuit, and investors pulling out. I was sitting at my desk at the bank where I worked back then, staring at the neat rows of numbers on my screen, while his words made my stomach drop. He had put everything into a real estate project that was supposed to be his big break. Instead, it collapsed under him, leaving debts so steep that legal letters were arriving daily. A week later, I drove to his apartment in Lake Oswego. Boxes were stacked in the hallway, and the air inside smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders slumped, eyes ringed in gray. We sat at his kitchen table, the same one we'd eaten cereal at as kids, and he slid a stack of papers toward me. $85,000. The number was printed in bold on the top sheet. It wasn't just what he owed on the project, it was penalties, legal fees, and interest. If he didn't pay, the investors would take him to court, and bankruptcy would follow. He said it like a sentence he couldn't serve. I had been saving for nearly a decade, every spare dollar tucked into an account I rarely touched. It was supposed to be for a down payment on a house, maybe a small one with a yard, something that felt like mine. But in that moment, looking at Robert with his hands knotted together, I told him I would help. I would drain my savings and take out a personal loan to cover the rest. The day we went to the bank, it was raining. I signed the loan papers with a pen the teller handed me, my name looping across the pages. Robert sat beside me, his leg bouncing under the table. When it was done, he looked at me with eyes that were almost wet. He said he didn't know how to thank me, that he would pay me back as soon as he could. That night over dinner with our parents, I told them what I'd done. My mother stirred her coffee and said it was good I could help. My father just nodded, as if it was the natural order of things for me to clean up after my brother. No one spoke about sacrifice or loss. Robert promised to put it in writing. A week later, we met again in his apartment. He handed me a typed agreement signed by him, stating he would repay the full amount within 3 years. I read it carefully, then signed my own name at the bottom. I kept that contract in a small fireproof safe in my bedroom, the one place I knew it wouldn't be touched. The repayments never came. First, there was a slow season at work, then a medical bill, then Claire's engagement ring, which he called an investment in his future. After a while, the subject stopped coming up. My parents never mentioned it either. It was as though the whole thing had been folded into some unspoken family ledger where my contributions didn't count. Once, about a year later, Emily asked me casually over coffee if Uncle Robert had ever paid me back. She was 20 at the time, home from college, and had overheard a fragment of conversation. I told her not to worry about it. She didn't press, but her brow furrowed in that way she gets when she knows I'm holding something back. Sometimes late at night, I would take the contract out of the safe and read it under the lamplight. The paper still smelled faintly of printer ink, the corners sharp. His signature was bold, confident, like he'd never doubted he could make good on it. I didn't keep it because I thought it would force him to repay me. I kept it because it proved I hadn't imagined it, that once I had been the one to keep him from drowning. Now, years later, I could still hear his voice in Linda's kitchen. That thing from 2016 will never come out. The words pressed hard against the memory of that rainy day at the bank, the pen in my hand, the way he'd looked at me like I was his last lifeline. I went to my bedroom. The safe was on the closet floor under a stack of sweaters. I spun the combination lock and lifted the lid. Inside, the contract was still there, folded neatly in a manila envelope. I took it out and ran my fingers over the paper. The number was the same. 85,000. It might as well have been carved into stone. I sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope in my lap. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping across the wall. I thought about all the times I'd chosen not to bring it up, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But now I wondered if that silence had been exactly what he was counting on. I slid the contract back into the envelope and returned it to the safe. The click of the lock sounded final, but it wasn't. It was only a pause. In the living room, the answering machine light was still dark. No new messages. The air felt heavy, thick with the past. I sat back down at the table and traced the grain of the wood with my fingertip, the number echoing in my head until it was no longer just a number. It was a reason. My phone buzzed just after noon the next day. It was a message from Emily, a single photo, and nothing else. She must have taken it quickly, the angle slightly tilted, the edge of her sneaker visible in the bottom corner. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. A table with papers spread across it, a pen resting near the top sheet. Then my eyes caught the heading in bold letters. Contract for venue rental. Malibu Seaview Estate. I zoomed in. The paper was crisp, the ink still fresh enough to shine in the light. There was a section titled Depositor Information. My breath caught when I saw the name printed there in black and white. EP Holdings, LLC. My initials. My small investment company. The same account I had set up years ago to manage what little savings I had left after helping Robert. The deposit amount was listed clearly. $40,000. Paid in full. I sat back in my chair staring at the screen. My hands felt cold, my chest tight. Emily must have been near the wedding coordinator's table when she saw it, her quick mind connecting the dots before I could. She had the sense to snap a picture without saying anything, but the image said everything. I typed a single message back. Where was this? She replied almost instantly. At the tasting today. The coordinator left it on the table while she went to get the dessert menu. I put the phone down and went to my bedroom. The safe in the closet was still open from the night before. I took out the envelope with Robert's debt contract and carried it to the desk in the corner. Then I printed the photo Emily had sent me, the paper sliding warm from the printer. I laid it beside the old contract. $85,000 in 2016. $40,000 now. Two pieces of paper separated by years but tied together by the same unspoken truth. My money had been there all along, flowing into his life, his plans, his celebrations, and now it was paying for a wedding I wasn't even welcome to attend. I leaned over the desk, both hands braced on the wood, and stared at the names on each page. The memory of the bank teller handing me the pen came back sharp and bitter. The rain on Robert's shoulders. The thank you that never lasted. The printer still smelled faintly of warm ink. I picked up the new page and held it in both hands. My initials looked strange in that formal font, stripped of any personal connection. Just letters tied to a number, another transaction that erased me as a person and replaced me with a funding source. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car slowed in front of the building before driving on. I felt the same quiet as last night, but it was heavier now, weighted with the proof that whatever they were hiding from 2016 had only grown. I sat down and began reading the Malibu contract line by line. There was a clause about cancellations, another about damage deposits. Everything was clean professional. No sign of anything unusual except the part that mattered most. The money. My money. I thought about calling Emily, asking her exactly how she found it, but I didn't want to pull her deeper into this than she already was. She had been careful slipping me this proof without alerting the rest of them. That caution meant something. The afternoon light shifted across the desk, the papers glowing in its path. I picked up Robert's old debt agreement and set it directly above the Malibu contract. Together, they looked almost like puzzle pieces, edges aligning in a way that made the picture clearer. It wasn't just about exclusion. It was about erasure funded by my own hand. I reached for a pen and wrote the dates in the corner of each page. May 2016. July 2024. 8 years between them, and not once had I been acknowledged in the way these numbers demanded. My phone buzzed again. Emily this time, with just 3 words. "Be careful, Mom." I looked at the papers, then at the phone, and felt the space between them narrow. Somewhere out there, my brother was celebrating the life he had built on what I had given him. Somewhere in Malibu, a venue was holding a date for a wedding I would only see in photographs. I pressed the pages flat under my palm, the texture of the paper catching against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt the shape of the truth settling into place. Not the whole picture yet, but enough to know I was finally looking in the right direction. I left the papers on the desk and turned off the light, letting them rest there in the fading glow. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. Each second seemed to land on the edge of something that hadn't happened yet. The morning felt like it never started. I stayed in bed long after the gray light seeped through the blinds. Emily's late-night message, "Be careful, Mom," still looping in my head. My phone buzzed twice, then went silent. I didn't reach for it. The apartment was too still, the air too heavy, and I didn't have the energy to invite anything in. A knock came mid-morning, sharp and familiar. Janet's voice followed, softening after the second knock. "Elaine, I brought you something to eat." My friend for over 20 years, and the only contract lawyer I trusted, always had a way of showing up without asking too many questions. Her footsteps shifted, the quiet pause stretching. I stayed curled on the couch, bare feet pressed against the cushion. Another knock, gentler this time, then the sound of something being set down outside the door. Through the peephole, I saw her walking away, her coat pulled tight against the wind. I opened the door just enough to pull in the white paper bag from the deli, and a plain manila envelope balanced on top. The bag was warm, carrying the smell of chicken soup and fresh bread, but the envelope drew my attention first. My name was scrawled across it in Janet's quick handwriting. Inside was a photograph. Robert and Claire stood in front of a pale rose backdrop, his hand at her waist, her smile frozen in that rehearsed way. It looked like an engagement portrait, maybe a trial shot for the wedding album. I was about to set it down when my eyes caught something at the very bottom edge of the frame, a wooden crate barely in view with EP Holdings printed in black block letters. My company name, my initials, unmistakable. As if the picture had been taken just to remind me that even in their perfect moments, I was there in some invisible way, holding up the edges. I set the photo on the counter and opened the bag. Soup bread, a folded napkin. Janet had slipped a short note inside. "Thought you might need something warm today. I'll call later." The answering machine light blinked in the corner. I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room again, calm and unshakable. "We've all agreed you're not welcome at your brother's wedding." The words replayed in my head, even after the message ended, mixing with the image of that crate at Robert's feet. I turned on the TV for noise flipping until a local news segment caught my eye. Robert, standing under bright event lights, was speaking into a microphone at a charity gala. The anchor's voice floated over the footage, calling him a self-made success in the Portland real estate market. I laughed, but it came out sharp and humorless. The TV showed him gesturing toward a row of donors, speaking about hard work, vision, and perseverance. Not one word about the debt I had paid, the years I had carried the weight he pretended never existed. The photo still sat on the counter, the crate in its corner, pulling my eyes back every few seconds. I picked it up again, the glossy paper cold against my fingertips. The anger that had been simmering all week shifted. It no longer felt like a bruise I kept pressing. It hardened, took shape. It wasn't enough to know they had used my money. I needed to see the full extent of it, every transaction, every quiet transfer, every place my name had been scrubbed away while the benefits stayed. I slipped the photograph back into the envelope and carried it to the desk. Now there were 3 pieces: the 2016 debt contract, the Malibu venue agreement, and this photograph. They didn't touch at the edges, but together they formed the early scaffolding of something bigger, a case file I hadn't realized I'd been building. Outside, the wind rattled a loose gutter. I sat at the desk, my hand resting on the envelope, and felt a pulse of clarity cut through the haze of the last few days. I didn't have the whole truth yet, but I knew exactly where to start looking. The photograph from Janet's envelope still sat on my desk, its glossy surface catching the thin winter light. Even now, my eyes went to the wooden crate in the corner of the frame, the one with EP Holdings stamped in black letters. It was like a fingerprint at a crime scene, small, undeniable, and mine. Next to it lay the other pieces. The 2016 debt agreement. The Malibu venue contract with my company name in bold across the header. And now this photo. 3 silent witnesses lined up edge to edge, waiting for me to connect them. I reached for the answering machine and pressed play. My mother's voice, calm, deliberate, spilled into the room once more. "We've all agreed you're not welcome at your brother's wedding." I wrote the sentence down on a legal pad, noting the faint lift in her tone after agreed, as if the word itself carried more weight than the rest. A verdict. A lock clicking shut. I underlined it 3 times. "We've all agreed." That meant a conversation without me, a vote I never knew was taking place. A decision made in a room I would never be allowed to enter. By mid-morning, the coffee in my cup was cold, and I was standing outside Janet's apartment building with a folder pressed under my arm. She opened the door in a sweatshirt and jeans, hair pulled back, eyes going straight to the folder. No hello. Just a quiet, expectant look. I spread everything out on her kitchen table, the debt contract first, then the Malibu venue agreement, then the photo. Janet's fingers moved slowly, scanning the pages until they stopped on the contract's header. "You see this?" she said, tapping the deposit clause. I leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" She turned the page toward me. "For high-profile events, especially when the deposit comes from a corporate entity, the depositor must be credited in the official wedding program. It's partly legal, partly marketing. They have to print at your company name somewhere visible in the ceremony booklet. They can't just leave it out. Not without breaching the contract." The words settled in my chest like a weight, but not the bad kind. If they followed the rules, EP Holdings would be there in black and white, handed to every guest before Robert and Claire even said their vows. I wouldn't have to crash the wedding or stand outside. The truth would walk in on its own. Janet leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You could use this. Not to stop them, but to make them own it." I thought of Robert under the bright lights at that charity gala, speaking about vision and hard work. Of Claire's polished smile in that photo. Of my mother's calm voice in the voicemail. They had all rehearsed their version of the story for years, sanding down every rough edge until I disappeared. But a contract didn't care about family politics. A contract only cared about terms. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. There was no need for a scene, no shouting, no confrontation. I just had to make sure the program went to print exactly as the contract required. The rest would take care of itself. Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. I walked home with the folder hugged tight to my side, the wind lifting my hair. For the first time in days, I felt my steps line up with something like purpose. Back at my desk, I stood looking at the 3 pieces of evidence, 3 anchors in a story they had spent years trying to set adrift. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about putting the truth in plain sight where no one could pretend it wasn't there. I uncapped my pen and began a list: who to call at the venue, how to confirm the print schedule, what proof I'd need if they tried to wriggle out of the clause. The wedding might still be weeks away, but booklets got sent to the printer early, and Robert had always been quick to find loopholes when cornered. If they thought I was going to let this one slip through their fingers, they were about to remember exactly who they'd underestimated. Janet showed up that afternoon with her laptop tucked under her arm like a briefcase. No coffee, no pleasantries, just business. She cleared a spot on my dining table, opened her email, and began typing. I stood behind her reading as she wrote to Stephen Hale, the Malibu wedding coordinator. Her tone was cool and professional, the kind that left no room for misinterpretation. She cited the venue contract clause word for word, attached a scanned copy of the page, and highlighted EP Holdings LLC in an unmistakable streak of yellow. When she hit send, she leaned back, folding her arms. Now we wait. We didn't wait long. Barely 20 minutes later, her inbox chimed. She clicked open the reply, and the first line was pure confirmation. The clause was binding, the payment traced and verified, and the depositor, my company, was entitled to printed credit in the wedding program. Then my eyes caught on the second paragraph. He had CC'd Claire and Robert. The phone rang almost immediately. Robert's name lit up the screen. Janet gave me a look that asked if I was ready. I pressed accept. Elaine, he said, his voice pitched lower than usual, careful. I think we need to talk. I said nothing. This thing with the coordinator. He drew the words out like he was trying to step carefully across a floor he knew might give way. It doesn't need to be made into a bigger deal than it is. We can work something out between us. The faint sound of voices carried through the line, Claire's sharper cadence somewhere behind him, the muted scrape of a chair. I could picture him in his office, pacing, one hand in his pocket. Work something out, I repeated. Yeah, he said. A pause. A throat clear. We don't have to make it public. I can make it worth your while to just let it go. The words landed with the same oily weight as every time he tried to buy his way out of accountability. My gaze drifted to the folder on the desk, the debt contract, the Malibu agreement, the photograph with the crate. My mother's calm, deliberate, "We've all agreed," replayed in my mind. No, I said. There was silence on his end. A shift in breath. Elaine, come on. We'll see each other on the wedding day, I said evenly. The line went dead. I stood for a moment with the phone still in my hand, the blue-gray of late afternoon filling the room. Outside, the city was sinking into that hour when the street lamps blinked on and shadows sharpened. Behind me, Janet closed her laptop with a quiet, decisive click. That's your first move, she said. Now let them decide how they want to play the rest. I didn't turn from the window. They'll play, I said. They always do. The first stone was set. The rest would fall. The calls began before sunset, unknown numbers stacking in my missed calls list one after another. I let them all go to voicemail. A text arrived from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. Are you really trying to embarrass the family over a booklet? I put the phone face down. The hum of the heater filled the apartment steady and low, like it was holding its breath. I could almost feel the ripple moving outward, Janet's email to Stephen, from him to Claire and Robert, then my parents, then the outer ring of relatives and acquaintances who barely knew me, but would still find a way to join the chorus. Then came the email from the community arts program where I volunteered on Saturdays. Due to recent developments, pausing your role until after the wedding. The words were polished into politeness, but they landed like a verdict. I could see the meeting in my head. Someone saying optics, someone else saying timing, nods around the table. Another vote I wasn't in the room for. My mother's voicemail followed. Cool, precise, like she was straightening a tablecloth while she spoke. This does not need to become a public spectacle. Think of your brother. Think of the family. We can discuss your concerns after the wedding. I deleted it without saving. My father didn't call at all. On my tablet, a friend sent me Claire's latest post. A golden photo, her hand on Robert's chest, light catching in her hair. The caption, "Protect your special days from negativity." The next slide was a block of text about grace and how some people confuse love with control. Hundreds of comments blooming underneath in perfect agreement. I shut the tablet and stared at the ceiling until my eyes blurred. Janet texted to check in. "You holding up?" I typed. "Yes," erased it and sent, "I'm fine for now." Her reply was short. "Here if you need me." By late afternoon, a knock sounded. I checked the peephole. Linda stood in the hallway, tote bag in hand, shoulders drawn tight. When I opened the door, she stepped in without waiting to be invited. "I thought you might not want company," she said, "so I'll be brief." She set the tote on the table and took out a small tin of cookies. Her eyes moved from the answering machine to the folder on my desk. "They started calling me this morning. Your mother, Robert, even Claire. They want me to talk sense into you." I waited. "They think you'll try to stop the ceremony." I told them you wouldn't. I told them you aren't interested in ruining anything. You're interested in the truth. The words seemed to settle between us. Linda took a breath that shook a little. "I've kept quiet for a long time, longer than I'm proud of. Back in 2016, Robert's failed project wasn't the only problem. A woman in his office filed a complaint serious enough that lawyers got involved. She didn't want court. She wanted it to stop. She wanted to be safe. There was talk of a settlement, a non-disclosure. Your mother didn't want the family name in any papers." The room tilted. Linda went on. "The money that ended it. It came through you. Robert didn't have it. Your loan, your savings, your name scrubbed off the check. I saw it then, the rainy day at the bank, the pen in my hand, Robert's jittering knee. The number I'd thought was only for debts and penalties had also bought silence. I told myself it was temporary," Linda said quietly, "that he'd make it right. Your mother said families handle these things in-house. She asked me not to tell you, said it would be kinder. But I see now what that's cost you." I kept my voice even. "Why now?" "Because if the program credits your company and questions start, this will come out anyway. You deserve to know exactly what you paid for." Her gaze held steady, but there was something like apology in it. "Your mother knew. She arranged some of it. Said you'd understand. Said you wouldn't ask questions." A silence spread dense and heavy. I thought of every dinner table since then, every time I'd pulled up a chair and tried to fit myself into the picture. I thought of that photo with my company name like a watermark in the corner, only visible if you tilted the page. Linda opened the tin, placing it on the table as if a simple gesture could steady the air. "Don't give them the chance to paint you as vindictive. Keep your steps measured. You're already holding the truth." I nodded once. "Thank you." She touched my arm briefly, then went to the door. "They'll try to make this about your behavior. Don't let them." The latch clicked shut. I carried the cookie tin to the counter. Butter and sugar rose faintly from it, but I couldn't taste anything. At the desk, the papers weighted: the debt contract, the Malibu agreement, the photograph with the crate. I took a blank page and wrote, "Settlement. Non-disclosure. 2016. Who knew?" A small list, but it made my hands cold. The phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "We should talk." I turned it face down and slid it away. Outside, the wind was pushing low, dark clouds in from the west. In the reflection on the window, I saw myself layered over the street, the folder visible behind my shoulder. The truth had a shape now not big enough to fill the whole frame, but big enough to change the picture. I folded my notes, slid them into the folder, and rested both hands on top of it. The heater hummed. A siren rose and fell in the distance. For the first time since my mother's message, I felt ground under my feet. Not steady, but there. I chose a place where I could still hear my own pulse. The coffee shop on Belmont had tall windows that caught the thin winter light, and the steady hiss of milk steaming made private conversations sound like background noise. I picked the farthest corner table, the folder resting in front of me like something alive. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, a slim notebook and one-hand pen clipped to its spine. His gaze swept the room before it landed on me. A brief wave. A quiet approach. No small talk. He sat the chair legs squeaking faintly against the tile and set his notebook down. "Thanks for meeting on short notice," he said. "I've got a window before heading back to the newsroom." I slid the folder toward him. He opened it as if one wrong movement might send its contents scattering. Page 1 read in silence. Page 2, brows tightening. Then the photograph tilted under the light until the faint black stencil at the bottom came clear. His eyes flicked to mine. I told him only what I could prove, the bank contract from 2016, with the figure that still lived in my bones. The Malibu venue agreement, my company in black letters under depositor. The clause requiring the ceremony booklet to credit the entity that paid. And the thing Linda had said in my kitchen about a year my family would never speak of. No speculation. No adjectives. Paper dates, numbers moving from one account to another without a thank you. He listened like someone building a map, not interrupting, not rescuing me from my own pauses. His questions came methodically. Where did each document come from? How did I obtain it? Did I have emails tying my mother or Robert to the payment? Any other proof beyond the contracts and photo? Only the paper trail and Stephen Hale's confirmation. He wrote everything down. From the counter, a barista called out 2 lattes with hearts in the foam. Daniel glanced up, then back at me. There's a story here, he said. But it has to be told without guesswork. I'll need your permission in writing. And if you want conditions for when I can publish. I told him I had 1 EP. Holdings must appear in the printed ceremony booklet. If it did, he could run the story after the wedding. If it didn't, he'd publish the day the programs reached the guests' hands without my name. He studied me for a beat. You understand what will follow, families fight. Reporters dig. You might be blamed for whatever they find. I'm not trying to ruin a wedding, I said. I want a line of truth on paper, that's all. He pulled a consent form from his notebook and rewrote it in neat block letters to match my condition. My name, his, the clause, the understanding that once signed, it couldn't be withdrawn. I read it twice. The words were simple. The weight wasn't. The coffee shop sounds dulled, as though someone had shut a door between me and the rest of the room. Then I signed slow, steady strokes in blue ink. My name looked like mine, but sharper, as if it had decided something without me. He slid the form into a plastic sleeve. I'll confirm the clause with the venue, try to get the booklet proof, ask for a statement from Robert and Claire. I won't publish until the conditions met or broken. If anyone calls claiming to be me, hang up and use the number I gave you. He stood, then hesitated. One more thing. Even if the booklet prints, your company people will ask why. Decide now what you'll say and what you won't. It'll save you later. When he left, the late afternoon light followed him out. I stayed. Let the foam on my coffee collapse. Let my hands remember they were cold. Outside, people walked by with paper cups, dogs tugging leashes, a couple arguing quietly before falling back into step. Life moved indifferent. Back home, I set the folder on my desk and opened a yellow pad. Venue coordinator contact. Booklet print deadline. Statement request from Robert and Claire. Alternative proof if booklet can't be obtained. And one more line underlined twice. Decide what I will say and what I will not. The apartment was still. My phone lit up once with an unknown number, then went dark when I didn't answer. I pulled the Malibu contract toward me. My finger traced the dry legal line, credit shall be given to the depositor in the official printed materials. On the page it was cold ink. In my chest it felt like air. I put the contract away and turned off the lamp. The room dimmed, the edges softened. In the dark, the consent I'd signed drew a clean, irreversible line through the day. I could feel where I'd been standing. I could feel where I would stand next. I didn't know how hard the wind would blow when the booklet was printed or erased, but I knew I wouldn't move. The heat in Malibu wasn't harsh, it was deliberate. The kind of golden warmth you could imagine a stylist ordering up for a magazine spread. The Seaview estate sat above the ocean like a set piece, all white stone and glass, the Pacific stretched out below in a haze of silver blue. Waves rolled in just far enough away to be background music. Guests drifted between the terrace and the champagne tables, linen and silk, moving in the slow rhythm of people waiting to be seated. I stayed on the periphery, water glass in hand, my pulse steady but ready. Stephen Hale stood near the sound system clipboard tucked under his arm, wearing the neutral smile of someone paid to keep crises invisible. Robert found him quickly, his hand clamping Stephen's elbow as he leaned in. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The lines of Robert's shoulders were enough controlled urgency, the posture of a man trying to edit a page at the printer. Stephen's eyes slid toward me. Just once. Long enough for him to know I saw him. Long enough for Robert to see that I had. Claire appeared silver fabric moving like water, her face a careful portrait of bridal serenity. She touched Robert's arm. He shook his head, jaw tight, gaze fixed on Stephen. Whatever they wanted from him, it was clear it wasn't an announcement. The coordinator at the double doors gave the signal. Guests began to settle into the neat rows of chairs on the lawn. I stayed where I was until the last one sat, their champagne flutes catching the sun like tiny mirrors. Robert and Claire took their place at the front, framed by the archway of pale flowers. They didn't look back. Stephen stepped to the mic. The chatter hushed. Before we begin, he said, his voice carrying over the sea breeze, we would like to extend our gratitude to those who made today possible. A pause. The faint sound of paper turning. In particular, we wish to thank the sponsor of this venue, EP Holdings, owned by Elaine Parker. It wasn't loud, the reaction, but it was immediate. A ripple through the rows. Someone inhaled sharply. A head turned. In the back, a short, surprised laugh escaped before being smothered. Robert's expression tightened into something brittle. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. Claire's bouquet shifted slightly in her hands, petals trembling against the breeze. Stephen moved on, voice smooth and practiced, into the rest of the opening. But the air had changed. The sentence was out. It was printed in every lap, spoken into the ocean air, and it would not be unsaid. I let the moment settle before I turned toward the gravel path along the cliff. Applause rose behind me, thinned by distance until it gave way to the low percussion of the surf. Past the valet stand, I stopped and looked back. From here, the ceremony was just a scatter of color under the arch, the couple reduced to silhouettes. I could still hear the microphone, the ceremony moving forward as if nothing had shifted. But it had. The booklet in my bag pressed lightly against my hip. A weight. A fact. I drew a slow breath, filling my ribs with the salted air, then let it out. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was the truth lodged now in a place they had built to erase me. When I reached the bend where the estate slipped out of sight, I paused one last time. The wind lifted my hair and I smoothed it back, feeling the horizon open in front of me. Then I kept walking, the crunch of gravel sinking with the rhythm of the waves, until the sound of the wedding was gone, entirely replaced by the ocean's endless, indifferent pulse. The drive north felt longer than the map promised. The Pacific ran alongside me like a witness who refused to speak, silver light catching on its surface as the sun sank behind my shoulder. The hum of the tires was steady, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the clipped tone in Robert's jaw, the way my mother's mouth had parted but stayed silent, the faint ripple that moved through the rows of guests when Stephen read my name. Somewhere past Cannon Beach, I pulled into a turnout. A rusted guardrail framed the drop to black rock and white water. The wind came harder here, salted and cold, lifting strands of my hair across my face. I climbed onto the hood, the metal still warm from the day, and let the ocean's breathing fill the space in my head. Each wave broke like an argument that had already been decided, loud, unrelenting, and pointless to fight. My father's old lines surfaced, the one he used when I was younger: family means standing together no matter what. I wondered if he'd ever imagined no matter what could mean standing together to erase someone. My phone buzzed in my jacket. I almost ignored it, braced for another demand to stop making a scene. But the name made me pause. Anna. My cousin on my father's side. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Her text was only 4 words: "You did the right thing." It landed in my chest like a weight, but not the kind I wanted to set down. Before I could decide whether to answer, another notification appeared, an email from my mother. No subject line. 6 words in the body. I hope you're happy with yourself. The cold in the air thickened. I read it twice. The meaning didn't change. My thumb hovered over the screen, but not for long. I deleted it. Anna's text stayed. I saved it not to reread, but to know it existed somewhere that wasn't in my head. By the time the sky shifted toward indigo, the lights of small towns had begun to flicker along the curve of the coastline. I slid off the hood gravel crunching under my boots, the taste of salt still in the back of my throat. The tide kept moving indifferent to who had been acknowledged and who had been told to stay away. I drove on. When Portland finally rose up out of the dark, the streets were hushed. I parked in front of my building and sat for a moment, engine ticking in the cooling air, the sound of waves still ghosting in my ears. Inside the apartment smelled faintly of the flowers I'd bought last week, petals just starting to curl at the edges. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and went straight to the window. The city lights scattered across the distance, imperfect, uneven, but still burning. I stood there until my shoulders unlocked, until the day loosened its grip. Then I turned off the lamp, letting the room settle into the same dark I'd left that morning. A week later, the air had shifted cooler and lighter, carrying the smell of damp earth from last night's rain. I was in the backyard, knees pressed into the soft soil, pulling weeds from between the late summer marigolds. The sky was a clean stretch of pale blue, the kind that made you believe in a quiet kind of change. The hum of the neighborhood was faint, the occasional sound of a dog barking or a screen door closing. I worked slowly, feeling the dirt crumble between my fingers, not thinking about the wedding or the voices that had been raised against me, just the rhythm of clearing space for something else to grow. A shadow fell across the flower bed, and I looked up to see the mail carrier at the gate holding a small padded envelope. I wiped my hands on the front of my jeans and met him halfway. He nodded, handed it over, and was gone before I could ask who had sent it. Back inside, I set the envelope on the kitchen table. The return address was from the venue in Malibu, but the handwriting across the front was careful and deliberate. I slid a knife under the flap, pulling out a thick envelope sealed with the venue's embossed crest. Inside was a single folded letter and a glossy booklet. The letter was from Stephen Short, and to the point, thanking me for my grace and understanding and expressing his appreciation for my support of the event. The booklet was heavier than I expected, the paper smooth under my thumb. I opened it slowly, my eyes scanning the first few pages of names, titles, and acknowledgments, until I reached the section that mattered. There it was, in crisp black print, venue, graciously provided by EP Holdings, owned by Elaine Parker. It wasn't large, but it was clear, unmistakable, the truth bound and printed, handed to every person who had been there that day. I traced the letters with my fingertip once, then closed the booklet. Carrying it to the bedroom, I unlocked the small safe in the corner and placed it inside right next to the worn manila envelope that held the contract from 2016. The two pieces sat side by side, silent proof of what had been taken and what I had reclaimed. I shut the safe and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the cool metal. There was no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication, just a steady quiet. The kind that comes when something is finally set down after being carried too long. Walking back to the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window. The marigolds were bright against the dark soil, their petals catching the late afternoon sun. Beyond them, the street stretched away in both directions, open and ordinary. I thought about the months ahead, about how some doors had closed for good and others might never open again. But in that moment, with the booklet tucked away and the garden waiting, it felt like enough. I let my gaze drift past the yard, past the houses and trees to the wide sky above. My lips moved before I even realized I was speaking the words, quiet but certain. Enough. Have you ever been shut out of a day that mattered to you? Share your story. Someone out there might need to hear it. It had been a week since the wedding, and the air had changed cooler, lighter, carrying the smell of damp earth from the rain the night before. I was in the backyard, knees in the soft soil, pulling weeds between late summer marigolds. The sky was a pale, washed blue, the kind that made you believe in quiet change. The neighborhood hummed, faintly distant barking, a screen door closing, the low whir of a lawnmower 2 streets over. My hands moved without hurry, crumbling dirt between my fingers. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about the wedding or the voices that had been raised against me. just the rhythm of clearing space for something else to grow. A shadow stretched across the flower bed. I looked up to see the mail carrier at the gate holding a small padded envelope. I wiped my hands on my jeans and met him halfway. He nodded, handed it over, and was gone before I could ask who had sent it. Inside at the kitchen table, I saw the return address Malibu Seaview Estate, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate, personal. I slid a knife under the flap. Out came a thick envelope sealed with the venue's embossed crest. The letter on top was short from Stephen, a thank you for my grace and understanding and appreciation for my support of the event. Underneath was a glossy booklet heavier than I had expected, its cover smooth under my thumb. I opened it slowly. Pages of names, titles, acknowledgments blurred past until I saw it. Venue graciously provided by EP Holdings, owned by Elaine Parker. Not large, but clear. Unmistakable. My name printed in every copy handed to every guest. Proof in black ink. I traced the letters, once closed the booklet, and carried it to the bedroom. The safe opened with its usual soft click. Inside, I set the booklet beside the worn manila envelope that held the 2016 contract. Two pieces of the same truth, finally sitting side by side. Silent, undeniable. I shut the safe, my hand resting on the cool metal. There was no rush of triumph, no fire of revenge, just a steady quiet, the kind that comes when you set down something you've carried too long. Back in the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window. The marigolds blazed against dark soil petals, catching the late afternoon light. Beyond them, the street stretched in both directions, open and ordinary. Some doors had closed for good. Others might never open. But with the garden waiting and the booklet tucked away, it felt like enough. I looked past the yard, past the roofs and trees to the wide sky above. The word slipped out before I even realized I had spoken it, quiet but certain. Enough.